Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. The video begins with a burst of nostalgia. Dusty saloons, clinking spurs, galloping horses silhouetted against a burning sunset. Classic Western movie scenes flash across the screen. John Wayne. Staring down outlaws, Clint Eastwood riding into town with stoic grit, and lonesome figures strumming guitars by firelight. Rodeo crowds cheer, country music echoes, and the cowboy's silhouette looms large. Rugged, free, untamed. These images are more than entertainment. They're woven into America's very identity. But then comes the voiceover, cutting through, the romantic haze. Rugged, free-spirited, heroic. But how did the cowboy become America's most enduring symbol? The real story might surprise you. As the visuals shift from Hollywood reels to historical photographs and rare archival footage, the montage begins to reveal a different picture. Cowboys of color, Black, Mexican, and Indigenous, ride alongside white frontiersmen, long overshadowed in mainstream tales. Instead of glamorized gunfights and lone wolf legends, we see branding cattle under blistering sun, grueling trail drives, and the day-to-day monotony of ranch life. A map unfolds across the screen, showing the spread of cattle routes, the rise of the cowboy after the Civil War, and how this rough-and-tumble lifestyle became mythologized across the globe. This is not just a story about boots and hats. It's about identity, race, class, and how legends are created. The cowboy is more than just a Western icon. He's a symbol loaded with contradictions and cultural power. And in the next 20 minutes, we're going to strip away the myths, unpack the forgotten truths, and reveal the real story behind America's favorite outlaw-turned-hero. To understand where the American cowboy truly comes from, we need to go far beyond the Hollywood soundstage and back in time, centuries before the Wild West ever took shape. The story begins not in Texas or Dodge City, but in the sweeping deserts and ranch lands of Mexico and Spain. It was the vaquero, the mounted livestock herder of Spanish colonial Mexico, who laid the foundation for what would become the cowboy tradition. These early horsemen emerged as far back as the 1500s, blending Iberian horsemanship with local indigenous practices. Their distinctive clothing, tools, and riding techniques, from wide-brimmed hats to lassos, were not just functional, but iconic. The term rodeo itself comes from the Spanish word rodear, meaning to surround, describing the way cattle were herded and managed. As Spanish missions and ranches spread into what's now California, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, so too did the vaquero way of life. These men were expert riders and skilled in managing vast herds of cattle, using techniques that had been honed over generations. The saddle, spurs, chaps, and branding irons, all staples of cowboy gear, were introduced and perfected during this era. The lifestyle was demanding and dangerous, often requiring long days on horseback, constant vigilance, and mastery over both animal and terrain. At the same time, Native American tribes, particularly those in the Great Plains like the Comanche, Apache, and Lakota, developed their own powerful horse cultures after the Spanish reintroduced horses to the continent. These tribes adapted quickly, becoming some of the greatest mounted warriors in history. Their relationship with horses influenced everything from hunting to warfare, and in some regions it also intersected with the growing cattle economy. By the early 1800s, as Anglo-American settlers pushed westward and took over Mexican lands following the U.S.-Mexican War, the vaquero tradition fused with frontier needs. Now in what would become Texas and the broader Southwest, these blended styles began to take on a new name: cowboys. The Anglo settlers borrowed freely from vaquero expertise, but gave it a new cultural spin. English replaced Spanish, but the skills remained: herding cattle over vast distances, roping, branding, breaking horses, and surviving in rugged, isolated conditions. This period marked the birth of one of America's most enduring icons, the cowboy. But contrary to the clean-cut, white-hatted hero of Hollywood lore, the cowboy was not born in isolation. He was the product of a cultural convergence that had been centuries in the making, a living, working hybrid of Spanish, Mexican, indigenous, and frontier traditions. The techniques, clothing, tools, and even the vocabulary of cowboy life, lasso, rodeo, chaps, mustang, came directly from the vaquero tradition, which had thrived in Mexico and the Southwest long before the U.S. expanded westward. Vaqueros. were the original cowboys, skilled horsemen and cattle herders who developed the methods that would define ranching in the American West. Many were indigenous or of mixed ancestry, living and working in complex colonial systems long before Anglo settlers ever arrived. When the U.S. seized vast territories from Mexico following the Mexican-American War, it didn't just take the land, it absorbed these people and their way of life. Settlers, many unfamiliar with the terrain and the craft, learned from vaqueros how to manage cattle, survive harsh environments, and navigate the open range. Native Americans, too, played a key role. Tribes such as the Comanche, Apache, and Lakota had mastered horseback culture long before most Americans arrived. They influenced both the style and the strategy of life on the frontier, knowledge that filtered into the cowboy tradition, even if it was rarely acknowledged. Black cowboys, many of them formerly enslaved, also shaped the reality of the West, finding work and some measure of autonomy in a region where rigid racial hierarchies were harder to enforce. But as time passed, and as the myth of the West began to solidify in books, dime novels, Wild West shows, and eventually film, the reality of this multicultural frontier began to fade. The cowboy was slowly whitened and idealized, turned into a symbol of rugged American individualism, stripped of the cultural roots that had made him possible. The vaqueros were forgotten, native contributions were erased, and the complexity of the cowboy's birth was replaced by a one-size-fits-all legend. Yet the truth remains. The cowboy is not purely American in the way he's often portrayed. He is a mosaic of Spanish colonialism, indigenous resilience, African-American perseverance, and frontier adaptation. Without the vaqueros, without the native horsemen, without the many unnamed laborers of color who built and maintained that way of life, the cowboy as we know him would not exist. To reclaim this story isn't to tarnish the cowboy myth, it's to enrich it. Because the real history, as always, is far more compelling than the legend. The period after the Civil War was a time of upheaval and opportunity. With the South in ruins and the economy in transition, the American West opened up like never before. And with that came the golden age of the cowboy, a brief but iconic era from around 1866 to 1890 that would cement the cowboy as a central figure in American mythology. At the heart of this boom was cattle. Millions of longhorns roamed free in Texas, bred for toughness and endurance, but they were nearly worthless without a way to get them to market. Enter the cattle drive, an epic journey where cowboys would herd thousands of animals over hundreds of miles to railheads in Kansas and beyond. From there, the beef would be shipped east to feed a growing urban population. This movement created new towns practically overnight and reshaped the map of the West. But life on the trail wasn't the romantic adventure Hollywood would later suggest. A typical cattle drive could last 2 to 3 months, covering up to 1,000 miles. Cowboys faced punishing heat, dangerous river crossings, stampedes, rattlesnakes, and the constant threat of rustlers or hostile confrontations with settlers or rival herders. Meals came from the chuck wagon, a rolling kitchen that followed the herd, and sleep was often just a blanket on the hard ground under open skies. Then there were the range wars, violent disputes over land, water rights, and fencing as cattlemen. Farmers and railroads competed for dominance in the West. These weren't metaphorical battles. They included gunfights, sabotage, and bloodshed, all part of the lawless reputation that clung to cowboy culture. Perhaps the biggest myth of all is what a cowboy looked like. While popular imagery gives us a rugged white male in a wide-brimmed hat, the truth was far more diverse. Historians estimate that up to 1 in 4 cowboys were black, many of them formerly enslaved men seeking freedom, wages, and respect in a profession where skill mattered more than skin color. Mexican vaqueros didn't disappear. They remained a huge presence, especially in the Southwest, where Spanish was still often spoken on the range. Native Americans, too, found work as cowhands, blending traditional horsemanship with cowboy duties, even as their lands and cultures were being systematically erased. And yes, there were women, often overlooked but undeniably present, who helped shape the cowboy era in ways both practical and profound. Though they were fewer in number, some worked as ranch hands, drovers, sharpshooters, and rodeo stars. These women didn't just survive in a male-dominated world, they pushed its boundaries. Figures like Lucille Mulhall, often called the first female cowboy, defied expectations by outroping and outriding men in rodeos across the country. Calamity Jane, both revered and mythologized, became a legend not only for her skills with a rifle but for her refusal to conform to Victorian ideals of femininity. Many women carved out space in this rugged world by sheer necessity. They ran homesteads, raised families in isolation, defended property, and built communities on the harsh, unpredictable frontier. Some disguised themselves as men to find work or protection. Others owned land, drove cattle, and participated in the very systems that defined the Western economy. Their presence was often undocumented, but their impact was undeniable. Beyond the white women who found fame in dime novels and Wild West shows, there were also countless indigenous, Mexican, and Black women whose stories went untold. They labored in silence, shaped the land alongside their families, and carried forward cultural knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. These women bore the brunt of colonial violence and cultural erasure, yet many also served as pillars of resistance and survival. This chapter of cowboy history was as harsh and complex as the terrain they rode across. It was a time of contradictions, of freedom and dispossession, of grit and glamour, of independence and injustice. The cowboy era wasn't just about cattle and courage. It was about the collision of cultures, the clash of economic systems, and the relentless push westward that forever altered the American landscape. The so-called golden age of the cowboy didn't last long, roughly 2 decades at most, but its myth has endured for more than a century. Its echoes shape American identity even now, woven into our movies, our fashion, our politics, and our sense of self. But to understand that identity fully, we must look beyond the myth to the people, men and women, Black and white, indigenous and immigrant, who lived it. Because in their real, raw, and often untold stories lies the true legacy of the American West. As the cattle drives dwindled and barbed wire closed off the open range, the cowboy began to vanish from real life, but he was just being born in the American imagination. The reality of hard labor, dust storms, and grueling months on the trail transformed into something else entirely. A larger-than-life legend. And that transformation began with words and spectacle. In the late 1800s, dime novels exploded in popularity. These cheap, mass-produced booklets were the entertainment of the working class, filled with thrilling tales of outlaws, gunslingers, and, you guessed it, cowboys. Writers like Ned Buntline churned out hundreds of stories, often barely based on real people but loaded with drama, fast draws, noble rescues, and shootouts at high noon. These stories gave readers in New York and Boston a fantasy version of the West, where morality was simple, justice was swift, and the cowboy stood alone against lawlessness. Real cowboys were often illiterate, paid poorly, and subject to harsh conditions, but in print, they were heroes. Then came the Wild West shows, most famously Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West. Starting in the 1880s, these traveling spectacles combined elements of circus, rodeo, and historical reenactment. Cody, a former scout and showman, recruited sharpshooters like Annie Oakley, native performers like Sitting Bull, and actual cowboys to perform before packed crowds in the U.S. and Europe. They reenacted stagecoach robberies, Indian battles, and dramatic rescues, always reinforcing the image of the cowboy as the courageous, self-reliant frontier guardian. It didn't matter that these shows distorted or outright invented history. The audience craved the myth, and the myth delivered. At the same time, newspapers in the East began to send writers and illustrators westward. Journalists like Frederick Remington and Owen Wister wrote flowery, idealized accounts of cowboy life that ignored the harsh realities. They described cowboys as chivalrous knights of the prairie, never mind the diversity or complexity of their real lives. This helped sanitize the cowboy image for a broader, more genteel audience, especially as urbanization made Americans increasingly nostalgic for a fading frontier. By the early 20th century, the cowboy legend was ready for its biggest stage yet: the movies. Silent film stars like Bronco Billy paved the way, but it was actors like Tom Mix, John Wayne, and later Clint Eastwood who turned the cowboy into a cinematic archetype. Hollywood exaggerated every element, the stoic silence, the showdown on Main Street, the lone man against the corrupt sheriff or gang of outlaws. These films didn't just entertain, they taught generations of Americans and the world what a cowboy was supposed to be. And so, through books, shows, journalism, and film, the cowboy myth was born, a myth that would eventually become one of the most enduring and powerful symbols in American culture. Whether he was galloping through dusty canyons or staring down villains with a steel gaze, the cowboy had moved from real life into legend, and from legend into icon. As the 20th century progressed, cowboys didn't just remain legends of the past. They evolved into pop culture icons, shaping everything, from entertainment to fashion to politics. The cowboy, once a rough laborer of the open range, became a symbol of rugged individualism and Americana. Western films played a massive role in this transformation, starting with silent movies and exploding in popularity in the 1930s through the 1960s. These films created an enduring template, a lone hero in a wide-brimmed hat, battling injustice on the frontier. John Wayne emerged as the definitive screen cowboy. With his drawling voice and unshakable confidence, he embodied the tough, no-nonsense masculinity that America came to associate with the cowboy ideal. Later, Clint Eastwood brought a darker, more morally ambiguous version to the screen in Spaghetti. Westerns like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and Unforgiven. These films didn't just entertain, they shaped national identity, reinforcing ideas about self-reliance, courage, and justice delivered at the end of a six-shooter. But the cowboy's influence didn't stop at the box office. Country music emerged as a powerful cultural force, with artists like Gene Autry, the singing cowboy, and later Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, and Garth Brooks keeping cowboy imagery alive through lyrics about heartache, freedom, and open roads. Songs about cowboys in the West gave voice to a romanticized rural lifestyle, even as America became increasingly urban. Meanwhile, cowboy fashion became a style all its own. Cowboy boots, hats, denim, fringe, and leather jackets, once practical, workwear were adopted as fashion statements. From Nashville to Hollywood to fashion runways, the cowboy look became shorthand for toughness and authenticity. Even today, cowboy hats are worn at country concerts, political rallies, and state fairs across the country. Rodeos kept the physical culture of the cowboy alive, evolving into a national sport. Events like bull riding, calf roping, and barrel racing are not just competitions, they're celebrations of frontier heritage. Rodeos became community events, especially in states like Texas, Wyoming, and Colorado, preserving the skills and values of cowboy life while adding a theatrical flair. And then there's politics. Few figures captured the cowboy as symbol more than Ronald Reagan. A former actor who played cowboys in films, Reagan used the image to great effect during his presidency. He leaned into the cowboy archetype, down home, straight-talking, tough on enemies. Whether riding horses at his California ranch or facing off with the Soviet Union, Reagan positioned himself as the ultimate cowboy president, reinforcing the idea of America as a bold, self-reliant power. From Hollywood blockbusters to rodeo arenas, from radio hits to political campaigns, the cowboy transcended his historical roots and became something far more powerful, a symbol. What began as a gritty, multicultural, short-lived profession was rebranded into a cultural archetype: stoic, self-reliant, ruggedly individualistic. This image wasn't just entertainment, it was ideology. The cowboy came to embody a certain vision of America itself. In film, the cowboy became a heroic lone figure, defending order in a chaotic land. John Wayne's swagger, Clint Eastwood's quiet grit, these portrayals helped solidify a narrative of American exceptionalism, of moral clarity in the face of frontier lawlessness. The complexities of race, gender, and class were edited out, leaving behind a streamlined version ready for mass consumption. In music, the cowboy ballad morphed into country anthems, songs about land, loss, pride, and perseverance. Rodeo culture flourished alongside it, turning ranch work into performance and sport, complete with Stetsons and star-spangled belt buckles. The cowboy outfit, once a tool of survival, became a costume of cultural allegiance. Even in politics, the cowboy identity proved irresistible. Ronald Reagan rode horses on his California ranch and leaned into his Hollywood cowboy persona to project strength and authenticity. George W. Bush donned boots and spoke in folksy Texas slang. The image worked because it connected with a deep American longing, the myth of the simple, good man doing the hard thing in a difficult world. But beneath all this branding lies a tension: the difference between the myth and the man. The real cowboys weren't invincible heroes. They were laborers, underpaid, often overworked, frequently forgotten. They were Black, Mexican, Indigenous, and white, and they lived hard lives shaped by land, weather, and cattle, not glory. Most weren't chasing justice. They were chasing a paycheck. Still, the myth persists. The cowboy, as repackaged by American pop culture, has become a vessel for nostalgia and nationalism, masculinity and freedom. It's a fantasy rooted in selective memory, yet one that continues to shape how America sees itself and how it projects its values to the world. The real cowboys may have driven cattle across the plains, but their pop culture descendants have driven the American imagination for more than a century. And maybe that's the most telling legacy of all: how a once-forgotten labor force was transformed into a lasting symbol of American identity, one that says more about what we want to believe than what actually was. The cowboy myth has endured for over a century, but behind the cinematic sunsets and noble shootouts lies a much more complex and often sobering reality. While pop culture elevated the cowboy to near-mythic status, brave, free, and always on the side of justice, the actual lives of cowboys were far more grounded, grueling, and diverse than the myth suggests. First, consider the day-to-day reality. The work of a cowboy was tough, dirty, and often monotonous. Long hours in the saddle, scorching heat, freezing nights, snake bites, stampedes, and the constant danger of injury were all part of the job. Cowboys earned little, often no more than $1 a day, and job security was non-existent. They weren't landowners or lords of the prairie. They were underpaid laborers driving cattle hundreds of miles across unforgiving terrain. The image of the fearless gunslinger also glosses over the loneliness and isolation of the cowboy lifestyle. Riders often spent weeks away from any town, with only their fellow drovers and a starry sky for company. Boredom and homesickness were common, and alcohol, gambling, and violence were frequent outlets when cowboys made it into town. Far from being constantly engaged in noble shootouts, most cowboys avoided violence, as it risked injury or death, luxuries they couldn't afford in such an unstable and demanding job. Another major distortion is the whitewashing of cowboy history. Despite what Hollywood has long shown, roughly 1 in 4 cowboys was Black, and many others were Mexican, Native American, or of mixed heritage. After the Civil War, many formerly enslaved men found work on ranches, becoming skilled horsemen and respected trail hands. Mexican vaqueros, whose traditions laid the groundwork for American cowboy culture, were also instrumental in shaping the skills, tools, and language of the cowboy way of life. Yet mainstream depictions consistently erased these identities, favoring a singular, white, male archetype. Today, the cowboy isn't just a relic of the past. Cowboys still exist, though their roles have changed with the times. Modern ranching is a high-tech operation, with ATVs, drones, and computerized cattle tracking systems often replacing the long trail drives of the 19th century. Rodeos, while now more sport than necessity, still test the same skills cowboys have used for generations, and they've grown into a vibrant subculture with deep roots in communities across the American West. There are also vibrant cowboy communities that keep the diverse legacy alive. Black rodeo circuits, Latino charreadas, and Native American rodeos all showcase the cowboys' continuing relevance in communities that history books once ignored. These groups celebrate tradition while pushing back against a myth that often excluded them. In truth, the cowboy of legend and the cowboy of history are two very different figures. One rides tall in the saddle, silhouetted against a blazing sunset, silent, righteous, and whitewashed into a symbol of rugged American virtue. That figure was carefully constructed, first in dime novels, then in traveling shows, and finally, on the silver screen. He was crafted to be a hero audiences could rally behind. A lone moral compass in a lawless world, someone who always knew right from wrong and never hesitated to act. It was a comforting myth, especially in times of national uncertainty, and it stuck. But the real cowboy was something else entirely. He was a laborer, often young and poor, sometimes an ex-slave or an immigrant, nearly always anonymous. He worked grueling hours in brutal conditions, facing dust storms, stampedes, and isolation for meager pay. He slept under the stars, patched his own clothes, and built a life not out of legend, but out of survival. His tools weren't six-shooters and catchphrases, they were ropes, saddles, and calloused hands. And that cowboy wasn't just white. As many as 1 in 4 were black. Others were Mexican vaqueros who had been perfecting the craft long before the U.S. annexed the Southwest. Native Americans, displaced from their homelands, became horsemen, and ranchers, integrating into a world that had once tried to erase them. Chinese laborers and white drifters alike found work on the open range. The cowboy was never just one thing, he was many, forged by necessity and shaped by a convergence of cultures. Recognizing that difference doesn't diminish the cowboy story, it deepens it. It turns a flat legend into a living, breathing history. It makes space for the forgotten voices, for the women, the workers, the people of color who helped build the West but were left out of its story. It reminds us that history is more complicated than myth, but also more human, more inclusive, and ultimately more real. And in a time when America still struggles with questions of identity, justice, and whose stories get told, maybe it's time we saddle up with the truth, not just the legend, because the real cowboy isn't less heroic. In many ways, he's more. The cowboy endures as one of the most potent symbols in American culture, not just for what he was, but for what he represents. Long after the cattle drives faded into history, the image of the cowboy remained firmly saddled in the American imagination. He's more than a man on horseback, he's an idea. A stand-in for independence, rebellion, resilience, and that distinctly American sense of rugged self-reliance. The reason the cowboy myth has such staying power lies in its emotional and ideological weight. In a country built on the frontier spirit, the cowboy became the embodiment of that frontier. Untamed, free, and fearless. He didn't follow the rules of the city or bow to institutions. He carved his path with grit and a six-shooter. Even today, when Americans think about personal freedom, the image of the cowboy, wide open skies, boots in the stirrups, no boss in sight, still resonates. Politicians have used it. Hollywood turned it into a genre. Brands co-opt it to sell. Everything from denim to pickup trucks. The cowboy represents the ideal of "don't tread on me," of carving out a life by your own hand, without interference. That message remains appealing, especially in times of social or political uncertainty. When people feel constrained by modern life, the cowboy offers a fantasy escape, a return to simpler times when right and wrong were as clear as the dust trail behind your horse. Globally, the cowboy became America's unofficial mascot. In Europe, Asia, and even parts of Africa and South America, people who've never set foot on a ranch still recognize the hat, boots, and spurs. The cowboy became shorthand for American toughness and iconoclasm, thanks in large part to movies and music. John Wayne and Clint Eastwood rode their way into international stardom, shaping foreign views of what it meant to be American. Even global leaders like Vladimir Putin and Emmanuel Macron have posed on horseback, consciously echoing that cowboy swagger. But there's also complexity in the cowboy's modern symbolism. Today, the cowboy has become a canvas for different identities. There are urban cowboys, queer cowboys, activist cowboys. The image has been reimagined and reclaimed, serving not just as a nostalgic throwback, but as a living, evolving emblem of American diversity and resistance. From Black cowboys challenging racial erasure to Indigenous riders keeping traditional practices alive, the cowboy identity now stretches far beyond the lone white gunman trope. Ultimately, the cowboy's lasting power comes down to his flexibility. He's a rebel, a patriot, a loner, a hero, and sometimes a villain. He represents what America wants to believe about itself and sometimes what it wants to forget. In a country that's constantly redefining itself, the cowboy remains a powerful reminder of how myth, identity, and history collide in the American story. From dusty cattle trails to viral TikToks, the cowboy has ridden through history as both a reality and a reinvention. We've journeyed from the early vaqueros of Spanish and Mexican tradition, through the diverse and dangerous world of 19th century cattle drives to the global rise of the cowboy myth in dime novels, Hollywood films, and political posturing. We've peeled back the myth to find real people, Black, Mexican, Native American, women, who lived the cowboy life but were too often erased from the story. And we've seen how that image continues to evolve today, as modern cowboys ride, in rodeos, on ranches, and across social media feeds, redefining what it means to wear the hat and boots in the 21st century. The cowboy may not have been what Hollywood made him out to be, but the real story, it's even more fascinating. It's a story of survival, reinvention, and identity. One that says more about America than any movie ever could. So if you enjoyed this ride through myth and reality, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There's a whole frontier of forgotten legends, untold truths, and hidden histories waiting to be explored. Drop a comment with your favorite cowboy, fact, or tell us how the myth shaped your own ideas of the Wild West. And don't forget to like and share, because history deserves to ride again.